Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting our series on the 1997 rematch between Garry Kasparov and the IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. Now, if you remember from 1996, our series, Garry Kasparov, at that time, again, the reigning world champion, won this series 4-2, and so IBM went back to the lab, did some tweaks to their computer, and said, okay, we now have a bigger, better, stronger, faster supercomputer. Deep Blue is now ready to take on the number one human at the time, Garry Kasparov, and so that's what we have. Garry Kasparov accepted the challenge in 1997. They met to play to see who was still the champion. Now, the format is still the same. They're going to be playing 6 chess games. They'll be switching off. Garry Kasparov would go first. In the first game, he would play white, and then they would, switch back and forth. Deep Blue would play black, and so forth and so forth. And at the end of it, if there's a winner, that would be deemed the winner. If not, they would move on from there. So in the first game we're going to be going over, it's game 1, again, the 1997 rematch between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue. White's going to be played by Garry Kasparov, and black's going to be played by IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. White's going to start out with knight to f3, ready opening, gives a lot of flexibility to Garry Kasparov to go into whatever opening or middle game he chooses to. Deep Blue's going to respond with pawn to d5, and then we have pawn to g3, getting ready to feed into his bishop here to g2. Then the bishop's going to come down to g4, getting his minor pieces involved. White's going to play pawn to b3, followed by knight to d7. Now, it would be completely okay if you're looking at it and you say, why does the knight come here to d7? Again, there's so many different variations. Black could have done many different things. He could have brought his knight down to c6. That would have been completely fine. He could have played his knight to f6. This is kind of one of those, black already has his light square bishop involved into the game, so he doesn't have to worry about blocking that. So he can bring his knight here to d7 and be completely okay controlling these dark squares here on e5 and c5. So White's going to continue with bishop to b2. Again, this is kind of that hyper-modern defense where White tries to control the center of the board with his minor pieces, and then later on into the board, later on into the game, he's going to try to push his pawns forward and control it. And as you can see, White's going to transpose into a King's Indian attack. So it's not the typical hyper-aggressive Kasparov that many of us have seen over time. But this is an opening that Bobby Fischer played a lot. It's definitely strong, and it gives White a lot of opportunities to go in a lot of different directions. Again, Garry Kasparov's not tying him to any particular opening. He can kind of go into the middle game however he wants to. It's very flexible opening. Black's going to play pawn to e6. And then White's just going to continue to develop his pieces, feeding his bishop here on g2. The knight's going to come to f6, simple development, getting all your pieces, getting ready to attack the center of the board. White's going to castle, and then Black's going to play pawn to c6. Now, if you played the Slav defense, semi-Slav, this is what you'll see a lot. You'll have this pawn here on c6, pawn on d5, and the pawn here on e6. Black decided to go ahead and bring his light square bishop involved into the game first, but connecting these knights here on d7, f6. Granted, you typically see the Slav and the semi-Slav against the Queen's Gambit, which it would be d4 to start the game and then c4. But it still plays fairly well against this type of opening. The only difference would be against the Queen's Gambit, Black's trying to play a little more defensive and then try to counterattack, where in this particular game, Black, even though he has kind of a defensive stance here, he actually has more initiative since White's playing even more conservative. He hasn't moved any of his pieces or pawns past the 3rd rank. So it'll kind of be more of a, an attacking Slav, defense if you're familiar with the Slav defense. White now plays pawn to d3. Again, still leaving him a lot of different options. He can always, play e4 if he wants to. He can bring his knight here to c3 and attack the center of the board, and then play queen to d2, completing his development, connecting his rooks on the last row. He could always bring his knight here to d2, connecting his knight. So again, allowing himself for a lot of different options. And then the bishop's going to come here to d6. In the Slav defense, you typically want to get your dark square bishop centralized, so it just has a lot of different options. And then White plays knight to d2. Now, White does have a lot of different options here. He could always, start to attack on the queen side. He could be a little more aggressive if he wanted. He could try something like, pawn here to c4. This is going to be completely okay, and then he could now bring his knight here to c3 after he's pushed that pawn. Garry Kasparov decides to play a little safer, kind of build up all of his pieces, connect them. So he brings his knight over here to d2, connecting it here to this knight on f3. Now, black's going to castle, and then white's going to push his pawn forward to h3, kicking this bishop back. Early on, you typically don't see high-level players giving up their bishops for a knight, so the bishop's just going to come back here to h5. And then the white's going to push forward to e3. We still have not seen a piece or a pawn move past that third rank for Garry Kasparov. So, again, he's just kind of waiting. He now has a little place. This queen can come here to e2 if he wants to. He's probably going to want to move this so it's not pinned down by this knight anymore, but just giving him a few more options. Now black's going to play pawn to h6, and white's going to play queen over here to h1. Wants to make sure that his knight's not being pinned, or his queen's not being pinned down by this knight here, this bishop here on h5. And now the queen's going to come over here to a5. Now white has a few different options. I kind of like just the pawn to e4. I think this gives him, a lot of fighting opportunities. He's really dominating the center of the board right here. He decides to play pawn to a3. I don't know if I would play that. It's Garry Kasparov, so he can kind of do what he wants to. He's the best chess player in the world at the time. But I do think he has more opportunity to attack. And with his queen over here on a5, he's not doing a whole lot if he plays pawn here to e4. I think that would be a little stronger move, but he decides to play pawn to a3. And then the bishop comes back here to c7, getting ready to defend this queen here on a5, and then get ready for some other attacks. So the knight's going to come over here to h4, and this is the first time that white has played a piece or a pawn past this third rank here. The pawn's going to immediately come down here to g5, kicking that knight off. Again, this is one of those moves. There's a few moves throughout the game that probably could have gone a different way and completely changed the outcome of the game. This is putting a lot of air, in front of this king right here. And so, anytime your pawns are pushing too forward in front of your king, you're leaving a lot of room. Now, you won't see it right away as far as the payoff because there's no pieces or pawns removed off the board, so Garry Kasparov just can't swoop in right away and start attacking the king. But as you'll see, there's just all this room in here, and slowly over time Garry Kasparov is going to be able to take advantage of that and find weakness. So he decides, okay, I'm just going to move my knight back here to f3. That was completely worth it to go ahead and move it here and then have this pawn come down here to g5. Black now plays his pawn to e5, getting ready if there's a center attack, getting his pieces and pawns ready. And now white decides to go ahead and play that move pawn to e4, saying, okay, I'm now ready to attack. I have all my pieces exactly where I want them, so I'm ready to go here. And black decides he's developed all of his pieces, and now he can start to get his rooks. You want to connect your rooks, and then you want to get them behind your pawns or to semi-open files or open files. So he decides to bring his rook over here to e8. As you'll see later on, he'll also get his other rook involved into the game. You really want them to play a supporting role kind of in that middle game, and then late game, your major pieces, your queens and your rooks, start to take over the game and start to do more. So from here, white's going to play his knight over to h2. It's not doing a whole lot, so he kind of wants to, later on get it into a better position. He could move forward with g4. Probably even smarter if he just played, g4 if he had, more support there. But just giving him options, he really didn't like it here on f3. So black decided to bring his queen over here to b6, attacking this pawn here on f2. Not a whole lot of attack, so white doesn't have to worry about it too much. He decides to come over here and bring his queen to c1. He does have different options. I don't know if that's the best move, but he decides to go ahead and play it. Black's going to go and come down and bring his pawn to a5, and white's going to go ahead and bring his rook over here to e1. So he wants to go ahead and open up this f1 square so that he can go ahead and attach it to this d2 square. Also, if he wants to go ahead and bring his knight here to e3, he has that opportunity as well. Now the bishop's going to come down to d6, getting ready to come to c5 and attack this pawn here on f2, which is kind of a weakness for white early on, since he only right now has his king that's protecting this pawn. So huge weakness early on for white is this f2 square, and for black it's typically the f7 square. Now the knight's going to come over here to f1, getting ready to protect this square here on e3. He can go ahead and jump there when he wants to. Black's going to go ahead and take here on e4, and white's just going to take back. And then the bishop's going to come here to c5 as we talked about. Now from here, white's going to play knight to e3, and we've reached equality. So if you look at both sides, black has one goal anytime he's playing black, and that is to reach equality, meaning that both sides should have around equal opportunity to win the game. So black is doing a really good job. He has all of his pieces developed into the game. He has a strong, center attack. If you look at white, all of his pieces are really working together. He has this dark square bishop that is eyeing down on this long diagonal. Black does have a little more air in front of his king, so it's going to be a little easier for white to attack this later on into the game. And all of white's pieces, there's nothing wrong with him. It's still going to be very difficult for black to find a weakness here because all of his pieces and pawns are very well defended. From here, deep blue plays rook to d8. Again, this is now a completely open file, so black decides, right away, let's go ahead and get that rook over here, which is a great move. Anytime you're looking for moves, you want to have your rooks connected. You want to bring them anywhere there's a semi-open or completely open, meaning there's no pawns in the way file. So that's exactly what he does. And then the knight comes over here to f1, protecting this knight here on e3. And then black plays pawn to g4. Now later on into the game, we'll start to look at some questionable moves. But I think this is really where black, starts to give up his position. As we, just a couple moves ago, we said black had reached equality. Black had, in my opinion, a really easy move to look at. When you're looking at the board, you want to look at pieces or pawns that are, over attacked and under defended. And so he could have, played bishop to g6 here. There's now two attackers on this pawn on e4. There's only one defender. It's going to force white to respond to this. White can't be, really attacking from here. He's kind of in that defense mode, which is what black wants to do. But instead of playing this, he keeps his bishop here on h5, which is not doing a whole heck of a lot, and instead plays pawn to g4, giving even more air in front of this king, which is really going to be difficult later on. So white decides to go ahead and play, takes here on g4, and then after the knight takes here on g4, then the pawn's just going to move forward to f3. Now, white has to be careful because this knight is now being pinned down to the king, and since black has both his queen here and his bishop here on c5, running down to here, he definitely has to keep notice of that. But there's just going to be some exchanges here. After the knight's exchange, then the bishop's going to come back here to e7. Now, white decides right away he wants to make sure that, his pieces are not pinned down anymore, so he immediately brings his king over here to h1, and then the bishop comes over here to g5. Now this is important for black because he recognizes, he being the computer, IBM supercomputer, but the computer recognizes, okay, and keep in mind the supercomputer probably thought about this, 12 moves ahead, but he realized that his pawn on the g file was gone. He had overextended it for one reason or another, and it was very important that he bring something back here and to protect it, or it was going to be very bad for him. So he found a nice little outpost here on g5 being protected by this pawn on h6, and it's kind of serving as that pawn protection in front of the king here. Now white's going to play rook to e2, and black follows with his pawn here to e4 or a4, saying, hey, I want to attack on the king side if you want to let me. White decides, I don't even want to worry about that. Let's just go ahead and play pawn here to b4. And then black starts to push forward. So he recognizes that his king side is kind of blown up. So he's going to try to counterattack on the king side and blow up the king side for white. White's just going to recapture here on f5. And then black's going to push forward with his pawn on e4. Now this is where Garry Kasparov is phenomenal and really shines, is because he looks at this and he says, okay, I have my rook here on e2, but the king side for black is really, really weak right now. So I'm going to go ahead and play pawn to f4, which black immediately played bishop takes the rook here on e2, but then the pawn's going to recapture here on g5. Now this is extremely important because, you know, Garry Kasparov now has two pawns right here that are going to be really hard to deal with. Now, just so we're clear, black really can't recapture here on g5, and I'll kind of show you why. White can now play knight to c4. Now this is a extremely powerful move because it opens the door for the queen to come here to, you know, g5. If the bishop were to take here on, you know, c4, then when the queen came here, the next move for white's going to be checkmate. There's nothing that black can do to stop this. Now if we look at it and say, okay, you know, obviously they don't want that to happen, but, you know, after the knight comes here, he's attacking this. The only thing that black can do to save this checkmate over here is to lose his queen here. So he would end up losing his queen on b6. This would definitely not be good. Black would be so far down in material. So Garry Kasparov saw this and saw, okay, I'm going to have my pawn on f5 and g5, and black can't recapture. So instead, black plays, you know, knight to e5, and this is an important move because it blocks off this long diagonal from the dark square bishop, which is where that mating pattern came from. But Garry Kasparov can now play pawn to g6, and, you know, it's really hard to look at something and say, you know, does a supercomputer not understand the significance or the importance of, you know, a pass pawn that's protected by another pawn here, both past the 4th rank? This is extremely valuable. You know, he looked at that, and so maybe the supercomputer said, I would rather be up a rook and give up a bishop, and I can just deal with this. But Garry Kasparov saw it a little bit differently, and so that's kind of what we have right here. Black now plays bishop to f3. Now, this is a good move. I do disagree that black allowed this to happen up here, giving this protected pass pawn. But the bishop here on f3 is a great square, and if you're always watching these games trying to figure out where you should go, for your minor pieces you always want to have an outpost, and a bishop down here on the 3rd rank, you know, being protected by a pawn here on e4, this is a great outpost for this bishop. He can just kind of hang out here all day. If the bishop were to take here, it's also a great outpost for the knight. He can recapture here on f3 and have a great square for his minor pieces. So this was a great move. White's now going to play bishop to c3. He wants to make sure he still controls this long diagonal, but he recognizes there's one place that you want your rooks, and it's on your opponent's 2nd or 7th rank. So black eventually would like to play, you know, his rook down to d2. Not right away, it would be captured obviously, but eventually. And white would, you know, he would like his rook on the 7th rank for black. So this is kind of a waiting move, and at the same time, it's just giving him better position, getting his bishop here to c3. Now, black's going to play, you know, his queen here to b5, getting ready to bring his queen to e2, and then swing over here once this knight was removed, but giving him a lot of potential to attack this king over here. White decides to go ahead and bring his queen over here to f1. His queen's not doing a whole heck of a lot, so he doesn't mind exchanging. Black decides to go ahead and exchange, and that's completely okay with Garry Kasparov because now he can not worry about this queen, and now he has his, you know, a1 rook involved into the game. Now the pawn's going to push forward with h5, and then Garry Kasparov's going to bring his king over to g1. He wants to now get his king involved into the game, start to, you know, take some of this pressure off, as we talked about. If the bishop came here and attacked, then the knight can take back here. So he wants to make sure that he gets his king involved into the game and stops any shenanigans. So if, you know, the bishop came here and took, then he could take with his king if he wanted to. He could take with his knight. He has a lot of different options. Now the king is going to come over here to f8. It's extremely important that you know, the king kind of stays back here. You know, he can let his rooks do a lot of the action. So the bishop's now going to come here to h3. And then the pawn's going to come here to b5. Just kind of solidifying this pawn chain, not doing a whole lot. It's kind of a whatever move. Doesn't really help since all the action is going on the king side. You know, but whatever. Now the king is going to come here to f2. and then the king's going to come here to g7, and this is really where black starts to continue to, fall further and further behind. This king to g7 move, if we look a few moves back, he just moved his king from g8 to f8, and then he decided, okay, there's a lot going on. I really need to make sure all my pieces are ready. I have this protected passed pawn on g7. I'm now going to move my king to g7. It's just very questionable. IBM could have easily played, his rook to d6, attacking this protected passed pawn, putting a lot of pressure on it. He could have gotten his other rook involved into the game. This would be so much better for black. It's going to be very hard for white to really find a continuation that's easily winnable. But instead, black decides to just kind of move his king around in the board, not really do a whole lot. So white decides, okay, I'm just going to start pushing forward. And so now the king comes to h6, and this may be an even worse move. The king's just not doing a whole lot, and so why he's trying to get involved into the game, completely separated from the rest of his pieces, I have no idea. He should really be looking for his rooks to get involved, start putting them behind pieces or pawns, and start to look for a strong attack here, because this is not going to go well for this king. So now the rook's going to come over here to g1, recognizing that there's about to be a lot of action. If there are some exchanges, he wants to make sure that his pieces are protected. And so that's exactly what happens. The pawn takes here on g4, and then exchanges back and forth. The bishop takes, the bishop takes, the knight takes, the knight takes, and then the rook takes here on g4. And as you can see, this is, although white is down in material, black is a little better because he has two rooks here on the d8 file and on the semi-open e file. Very strong, but white has this, pass pawn here. He now has a pass pawn on the f file, and this is all of white's pieces are working together, all working with these pass pawns. There's no way that black can stop this. Now black decides to go ahead and bring his rook down here to d5, which is an okay move. Wants to stop it, as best he can. If this pawn were to push forward anymore, he could swing his rook over here to f5. Attacking both the king and the pawn. So kind of giving himself some options. He's, IBM Supercomputer Deep Blue is finally figuring out that he needs to actually get these rooks involved into the game. He can't just dance around with his king all day, because his king is just kind of on the sidelines, just allowing white to push up the board. There's no reason for that king to be here on h6. And white decides to go ahead and push forward with f6. And black has a lot of different options, and he, Supercomputer Deep Blue, decided to choose the worst option, and that is to bring his rook down to d1, which does absolutely nothing. There's no benefit gained at all. There were so many different options that he could have played. We talked about some others, but he could have just brought his rook over here to g8. That would have definitely been better, stopping something. But instead, he played rook to d1, and then immediately Garry Kasparov played pawn to g7, and black was forced to resign. There's really no way for black to stop anything now, and his rook on d1 move didn't do anything. And it was interesting after the game, although it was a horrible move, this d1 move completely perplexed Kasparov. He was just completely confused. Had no idea. He kind of thought that the computer was trolling him almost. Had no idea why this move was played. But as we talked about before, this bishop on c3 is very, very powerful because the knight can't come here to d2. So Garry Kasparov played a fantastic game. That one point he gave up his rook for a bishop just so he could get these pawns over here for a protected pass pawn. His vision to see it to the end of the game, knowing that black would not be able to stop this later on, just phenomenal, especially against a supercomputer that, for the past year, the entire IBM team had just been trying to figure out how to get this machine to beat Garry Kasparov. So, game one, phenomenal. Garry Kasparov goes up 1-0. We'll be continuing our series later on, going through the other matches in this series, but hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.